The day dawned sweltering and still, the kind that often settles over the Appalachian foothills in late summer. The air inside the small sheriff's office was thick and heavy, smelling of dust, old paper, and the faint tang of gun oil. The ceiling fan turned lazy circles, stirring the warm currents but offering no relief. Sheriff Clayton Clay Bodra sat behind his massive oak desk, a surface piled high with folders, reports, and the assorted detritus of bureaucracy. His large frame, snug in its khaki uniform, seemed an immovable rock amid the sea of paperwork. His close-cropped hair, graying at the temples, was damp with sweat. The deep lines etched on his forehead and around his eyes seemed sharper in the bright light slanting through the window. He methodically reviewed a report on a petty theft from the general store on Main Street. Teenagers had lifted a couple of six-packs. Then he moved on to the write-up of a domestic dispute out at the McGregor farm. Old Jim feuding with his neighbor over a property line again. Routine. The small troubles of a small town he knew like the back of his hand. He'd been born here, grown up here, served a tour with the Marines, come back, and become the law. His square jaw was set firm, his gray eyes scanning the lines, betraying nothing but concentration. The jangle of the phone cut through the fan's monotonous drone. Clay picked up the receiver, cradling it between his shoulder and ear, still jotting notes in his pad. The voice on the other end belonged to Martha Henshaw, owner of the small motel just outside of town. She spoke quickly, her voice tight with worry. A tourist, photographer, checked in 2 days ago. Name: David Carter, from some big city up north. Left this morning, heading into the woods for a couple of hours to photograph the falls up at Bear Creek. Promised he'd be back for lunch. Now it was nearing evening and not a peep out of Carter since. His car was still parked at the motel. Martha was worried. Clay listened in silence, tapping his pen on the desk. Missing tourist. Happened all the time. Folks underestimated the woods, wandered off the trail, got turned around. Usually found their own way back by morning, spooked and scratched up. He asked Martha a few clarifying questions. What he was wearing, what gear he had, if he'd mentioned a specific route. Getting only sparse answers, he promised he'd send someone to check it out. He hung up, stared for a few seconds at the county map pinned to the wall. Bear Creek. Popular spot, the trail was pretty well marked. He radioed his young deputy, Bill Miller. Miller, a lean kid about 25, appeared in the doorway almost immediately, buttoning his collar. Clay laid out the situation briefly. Take a couple of volunteers from the SR team, he ordered, his voice a low rumble. Hike the main trail up to the creek. Keep your eyes peeled. Probably just lost, sitting under a tree somewhere, waiting it out. Miller nodded, his face serious. He always took the sheriff's orders with utmost attention. Clay watched him go, then turned back to his paperwork. The odds of it being anything serious were slim, or so he thought at the time. The sun was already dipping toward the pine tops, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, when Miller and the volunteers returned. They were tired, scratched up by branches. Miller's report was brief. They'd followed the trail to the falls and a bit beyond, scouted the surrounding area. No sign of Carter. The only find his camera backpack, sitting neatly right by the water's edge, about half a mile upstream from the main waterfall. The pack was closed. Inside were spare lenses, filters, a water bottle, an untouched sandwich. No sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing out of the ordinary, except for one thing. Miller hesitated, searching for the words. There were tracks by the water, Sheriff, near the pack. Kind of strange. Clay raised an eyebrow. Strange? Well, big. And indistinct, Miller explained. Ground's wet there, Clay. Maybe the water washed them out? Looked like bear tracks, maybe, but smeared. Clay's frown deepened. There were bears in these woods, black bears. Usually they steered clear of people. Get pictures? He asked. Miller nodded and handed over the department camera. Clay scrolled through the images. The tracks were indeed large, but the outlines were blurred. You could mistake them for a bear's, especially if the animal had been stepping on the wet ground near the creek. He handed the camera back to Miller. All right, we're wrapping up for tonight. We'll bring in the rangers in the morning, widen the search grid. The decision was pragmatic. Searching the woods at night was nearly useless and dangerous. Better to wait for daylight. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a faint unease took root. An abandoned pack with no sign of a struggle. That was a little strange. The next morning brought the same oppressive humidity and a fresh wave of activity. 3 park rangers joined the search operation, led by Senior Ranger John Henderson, an experienced woodsman with a weathered face and calm eyes. They split into teams, methodically combing sector after sector, moving out from where the backpack was found. Clay coordinated from his office, checking in with the teams periodically via radio. Around 11 that morning, the radio crackled to life again. One of the rangers' voices sounded strained. They'd found something. About a mile northwest of the creek, in dense undergrowth. Clay told them to stay put and touch nothing. He got into his department pickup and headed for the rendezvous point at the edge of the woods. The drive took about 20 minutes. Leaving the truck, he followed Miller, who met him, down the forest trail. The silence of the woods pressed in, broken only by the snap of twigs underfoot and the calls of unseen birds. When they reached the spot, Clay understood the reason for the tension in the ranger's voice. In a small clearing, amidst ferns and moss, lay remains. Or rather, what was left of them. The first thing that caught the eye was a hiking boot. Heavy, treaded, the toe scuffed. Protruding from the boot's opening was a shred of pant leg and the remains of a human leg, gnawed clean to the bone. The bone was white, marked with the distinct impressions of large teeth. A little further off, scattered over an area of several yards, were other fragments, shreds of clothing, a blue jacket, a plaid shirt, several broken and gnawed bones, a vertebra, part of a rib. The ground around was torn up, marked with patches of dried blood. Clay slowly circled the gruesome discovery. His face was impassive, but his eyes meticulously recorded every detail. He crouched beside the boot, careful not to touch it. The teeth marks on the bone were deep, too deep and wide for coyotes or bobcats. The bones weren't just gnawed. They were broken, splintered with immense force. He lifted his gaze to the trunks of the nearest trees. Long, deep scratches scarred the bark diagonally. They were higher than a man could reach. His pragmatic mind, accustomed to seeking logical explanations, quickly formed a working theory. A large black bear, possibly old, sick, or injured, making it uncharacteristically aggressive, causing it to attack a human. It happened, though rarely. He stood up. Cordon off the area, he ordered the rangers. Keep everyone out. Document everything thoroughly. He turned to Miller. We're heading back to town. On the way back, Clay considered the next steps. The public needed to be warned. Back in his office, he drafted a brief official statement. A warning about a dangerous predator, presumed to be a large bear in the vicinity of Bear Creek. Strongly advising residents and tourists to avoid the woodlands in that area until further notice. He told Miller to post notices on the town bulletin boards at the general store, the post office, and to relay the information to Martha at the motel. The news spread through the small town like wildfire. A small town thrives on rumor and word of mouth. A low-level but palpable wave of panic began to ripple through the community, especially among those whose homes bordered the woods. People locked their doors earlier than usual, listened more intently to the sounds of the night. At Tom Hanks's gun shop, sales of shotgun shells and rifle cartridges picked up noticeably. Old-timers dredged up long-forgotten stories of bear encounters, each tale growing new, more frightening details in the retelling. That evening, John Henderson, the senior ranger, called Clay. He'd finished his examination of the scene and wanted to share his observations. Henderson was an expert tracker and knew the habits of the local wildlife better than anyone. "Clay," he began without preamble, his voice serious over the line. "I went over everything again. The bites, the nature of the damage. It doesn't quite track with a black bear. The claw marks on the trees, yeah, they're deep, but the placement is odd, like, I don't know." He paused, choosing his words. "And the tracks on the ground near the remains, the clearer ones. They're huge, but the shape, not exactly bear-like." Clay listened silently, his fingers tightening on the receiver. Henderson's doubts fueled his own underlying unease. "You got another theory, John?" he asked evenly. "No," Henderson admitted. "Nothing that makes sense. Just something's off." Clay didn't like uncertainty. It hampered action. "For now, we stick with the bear theory," he said firmly. "It's the most logical explanation. We'll organize a controlled hunt. My guys and your rangers. We need to find this animal and neutralize it before it does any more damage." He didn't want to bring in civilian hunters yet. That could lead to chaos and accidents. Best to try handling it with their own resources first. He hung up, gazing out the darkening window. Night fell over Pine Creek, bringing a temporary lull, but no peace. Residents double-bolted their doors, listening nervously to every rustle outside their windows. The woods, usually seen as a source of tranquility or recreation, now seemed a dark, menacing presence, looming at the edge of their orderly little world. Clay Boudre couldn't sleep, turning over the details of the missing tourist case and Henderson's words in his mind. The inconsistencies nagged at him, disrupting the usual flow of his thoughts, where everything was supposed to have a rational explanation. Around 3 a.m, the harsh ring of the phone beside his bed jolted him from a restless half-sleep. It was dispatch. A panicked voice reported an incident at old Elijah Cutter's farm, located on the farthest edge of town, almost at the forest line, a couple of miles off the main road. A neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, no relation to the ranger, had been woken by furious barking and strange sounds like squealing and roaring coming from the direction of Cutter's farm. She'd seen a flashlight beam bobbing wildly near the chicken coop. Then everything went silent. When she finally worked up the nerve to call Elijah, there was no answer. She was too scared to go outside. Clay dressed in minutes, his movements swift and precise, like a well-oiled machine. He grabbed his pickup keys and his trusty .44 Magnum, checking the cylinder. On the way, He radioed Miller, telling him to head to Cutter's farm immediately. When Clay reached the nondescript turnoff to the farm, his headlights cut through the darkness to reveal Miller's cruiser already parked by the gate. Miller was waiting, a heavy-duty flashlight in hand. The air crackled with tension. Cutter's dog, an old bloodhound named Duke, who usually greeted any visitor with a deafening bay, was silent. That was a bad sign. They moved toward the house. The door was unlocked. Inside, things were messy but showed no signs of a struggle. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on the kitchen table. Looked like the owner had just stepped out for a minute. The real horror awaited them outside by the chicken coop. The wooden door, sturdy, built of thick planks, had been torn from its frame with such force that splinters littered the ground for yards around. The hinges had been ripped from the jamb. The ground in front of the coop was strewn with feathers and soaked in blood. Most of it was dark, chicken blood, but among it were brighter, scarlet splashes that were unmistakably human. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of fear. Inside the coop was a slaughterhouse. Mangled chicken carcasses lay everywhere. Of Elijah Cutter himself there was almost nothing left. Only a wide blood trail dragging from the coop across the yard and disappearing into the black wall of the forest. Beside the trail, lying in the mud, was the farmer's shattered flashlight, and something else. In the damp earth churned up with blood and feathers were clear tracks. Huge, deep impressions left by paws armed with long claws. The same strange tracks Miller had seen by the creek, only here in the firmer soil they were sharper, and they were nightmarishly large. Miller shone his flashlight on the tracks, his hand trembling slightly. "Sheriff, these are—" he began, but Clay silenced him with a gesture. He crouched down himself, studying the prints intently. They were definitely larger than any bear's. And the shape. Henderson had been right. Something was wrong with them. They resembled the prints of a giant wolf or dog, but the size was impossible. And the claws, long, thick, sickle-shaped, leaving deep gouges in the earth. Clay slowly followed the line of tracks with his eyes as they led toward the forest. In one spot, the rear prints were deeper, and the front ones were barely visible, as if the creature had briefly reared up. He frowned. Maybe the beast had risen up to get a better look, or maybe it had something to do with dragging the farmer's body. Clay's rational mind clung to explanations, but they felt increasingly flimsy. He stood. "Get everyone out here," he ordered Miller. "Secure the farm. Nobody in or out. We need to go over everything thoroughly at first light." News of the attack on the Cutter farm and Elijah's disappearance hit the town before sunrise. The low-level panic of the previous day escalated into raw fear bordering on hysteria. Now the threat wasn't just out there in the woods. It was right on their doorsteps. People flooded the sheriff's office with calls, demanding immediate action, demanding protection. Some, especially those on the outskirts, dug out old shotguns and rifles, deciding to guard their own homes. The town mayor, a short, fussy man named Stevens, called Clay early. His voice trembled with fear and poorly concealed anger. He demanded Clay catch that damn bear immediately, threatening otherwise to call in the state police and the National Guard. Clay hated outside interference. This was his town, his responsibility. But he knew the situation was spiraling out of control. The resources of his small office and the handful of rangers were clearly not enough to comb the vast wilderness where such a dangerous predator might be hiding. He made a decision he didn't like, but one that had become necessary. Bring in the local hunters. He knew most of them personally. Solid, reliable men who knew the woods and how to handle a gun. He contacted several of the most experienced and respected among them, explained the situation, and asked for their help. They agreed without hesitation. By noon, about 15 men had gathered at the temporary command post set up near the edge of the woods by Cutter's farm. Sheriff's deputies, rangers, and the hunters Clay had selected. Clay gave them a short, hard briefing. The target is a large, extremely dangerous predator, he said, his heavy gaze sweeping over the assembled men. Presumably an abnormally large black bear. We operate only in teams, minimum 3 men. Maintain constant radio contact. No wandering off. You shoot to kill only if there's a direct threat to your life or the life of a teammate. Our job is to find it and neutralize it. Be extremely careful. This thing has already killed 2 people. While the teams prepared to move out, Clay and Ranger Henderson went back to look at the tracks by the coop one more time. The daylight allowed for a better view. Henderson shook his head. Clay, look closely. The print. It's longer and narrower than a bear's, and the pads arranged differently. More like canine, but the size. And here? He pointed to the spot where the rear prints were especially deep. The stride length. It looks like it walked on 2 legs for a stretch. Bears can stand up, but walk like that for any distance. Clay stared at the tracks, his certainty about the bear theory eroding. But what else could it be? Old loggers' legends about strange creatures in the mountains? Nonsense. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe some kind of hybrid escaped from an illegal menagerie, or an undiscovered species. He pushed the thoughts away. Now was the time for action, not speculation. Just be ready for anything, he told Henderson. The first teams of hunters, rangers, and deputies entered the woods, following the trail of blood and paw prints leading away from the Cutter farm. They moved slowly, carefully scanning every bush, every tree. Clay remained at the command post, coordinating the operation over the radio, a map of the area spread out before him. He marked the team's progress, took reports. Outwardly he was calm and focused, but inside a dull anxiety grew. Too many oddities. Incredible strength, savagery, the mysterious tracks, the possibility of bipedal movement. His pragmatic mind resisted, but the facts stubbornly refused to fit into his familiar worldview. He sensed they were dealing with something more than just a dangerous animal. Something ancient, dark, and fundamentally wrong. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip, one of the teams, composed of 3 experienced local hunters, radioed in that they heard something ahead. Loud snapping of branches and a low, menacing growl. The hunter's voice was tense but steady. They were advancing cautiously. Clay ordered them to maintain contact and report their status. A minute later, the radio crackled, a shout, then another, followed by silence. Clay hailed the team again and again, but the only answer was the hiss of static. The silence on the radio was deafening. Clay stared at the unit for a few seconds, his face hardening into an impassive mask. Then he moved, swiftly, decisively. He assembled a reinforcement team, himself, Miller, Henderson, and 2 more armed rangers. He grabbed a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, checking the shells, buckshot and slugs. The others had similar weapons plus rifles. Moving to Baker Team's last known coordinates, he snapped, and they headed toward the woods at a near run. Twilight deepened beneath the canopy, making the forest dim and ominous. They moved quickly but carefully, constantly scanning their surroundings, weapons ready. The tension was almost palpable. After 20 minutes of tense progress, they reached the small clearing where contact had been lost. The scene that greeted them was horrific. 2 of the hunters from Baker's team were dead. Their bodies had been torn apart with the same inhuman savagery as the remains of the tourist Carter. Blood soaked the earth and leaves around them. Their rifles lay nearby. One had been fired. Spent casings glinted on the ground. The 3rd hunter, Jim Baker himself, the youngest of the group, was gone. The place looked like a battlefield. The ground was trampled, bushes broken. Signs of a desperate struggle. And again, blood. Not just the victims. Clay spotted several large, almost black drops of thick, viscous fluid on the fallen leaves. Definitely not human blood. He had Miller carefully collect samples in a sterile bag. Near these drops were the same enormous tracks, exceptionally clear here. One print was smeared, a shallow furrow beside it. Looked like the creature had been hit, lost its footing for a moment, perhaps limped. But a few yards further on, the tracks were even and confident again, leading deeper into the thicket. It seemed the wound had only momentarily slowed it. Clay swore under his breath. This thing wasn't just strong and savage, it was incredibly resilient. They fanned out slightly to quickly search the immediate area for the missing Baker. Henderson found him first, about 50 yards from the clearing. Baker was alive, but in deep shock. He sat on the ground, leaning against a tree trunk, eyes wide and vacant. His clothes were torn, his face and arms scratched, but he had no serious injuries. He just stared straight ahead, muttering incoherently. Clay knelt beside him, tried to speak calmly but firmly. "Baker. Jim. What happened? What did you see?" It took time for Baker to focus his gaze and begin to speak. His words were fragmented, confused, punctuated by shudders. Huge, fast, gray fur, like a wolf, but enormous. He took a ragged breath. Eyes, yellow, glowing in the dark. "We shot it. It didn't even flinch." His voice broke. Then it stood up, on its hind legs, tall as a man. No, taller. And it came at Bill and Frank. He fell silent, shaking again. Clay listened intently, his face like stone. Part of the story could be chalked up to shock, fear, tricks of the fading light. But the mention of the creature standing on its hind legs struck him again. It matched his own observations of the tracks at the Cutter farm and the oddities Henderson had noted. He helped Baker to his feet, handed him over to one of the rangers. They needed to get him out of the woods and back to town. News of the deaths of 2 more men, local hunters this time, plunged the town into a state of panic bordering on mass hysteria. No one doubted now that something other than a man-eating bear lurked in the woods. Fear became almost tangible. People locked themselves indoors as darkness fell. Some families hastily packed bags, sending children to relatives in other towns. Mayor Stevens called Clay again, no longer hiding his fury and terror. He shouted that if Clay didn't solve this immediately, he'd call not just the state police but the governor, demand the National Guard. Clay listened to the tirade in silence. The mayor's threats didn't move him, but he knew the pressure would only increase, and that people's lives were truly in danger. He had to act. He took the blood samples found at the hunter's attack site to the only person in town who could run any kind of analysis, Doc Hoffman, the local veterinarian. Hoffman had a small lab for animal tests. Clay didn't expect miracles, but any information could be useful. The results, a couple of hours later, were predictably strange. Hoffman, an elderly man peering through thick-lensed glasses, spread his hands. "Clay, I don't know what this is. It's definitely mammalian blood. Blood type. Doesn't register on standard tests. White cell count is off the charts. Some kind of anomalous proteins. I've never seen anything like it. Doesn't match any known local species. Not bear, not wolf, not mountain lion." Clay took the report. Anomalous blood. Incredible strength. Bipedal capability. Resistance to injury. The picture forming was increasingly monstrous and unbelievable. He returned to his office, spread the map out again. The standard bear hunt had failed, leading to more deaths. This creature was smarter, cunninger, and far more dangerous than any animal. It wasn't just acting on instinct. It seemed possessed of a sort of malevolent intelligence. He had to change tactics. He radioed all remaining teams in the woods, ordering them back immediately. New instructions were strict. Search parties would be larger, minimum 5 or 6 men. Armament would be the most powerful available. Shotguns loaded with slugs, military-style rifles if available. Constant radio checks, report in every 15 minutes. Move with extreme caution, post lookouts. If forced to stay out overnight, establish a defensible camp. Use trip flares around the perimeter. Nights in town became periods of acute fear. Residents locked not just doors, but window shutters. Any sound from the woods, a coyote's howl, a snapping twig, an owl's hoot, sent hearts pounding. People whispered about strange noises in the night, a long, chilling howl unlike any known animal, a low growl that vibrated window panes. Clay increased patrols along the town's edge, though he knew it was more a psychological measure for the terrified residents. The real threat was out there in the deep woods. He felt the crushing weight of responsibility for the dead, for the fear gripping his town. The failures so far pressed down on him. He could no longer just coordinate from the office. He had to go out there himself. He had to face this thing. The next morning he decided to personally lead one of the reinforced search teams. He'd take Miller. Despite his youth, the kid was brave and dependable. And a couple of Henderson's most reliable rangers. They would follow the trail the creature left after the attack on the hunters. They would find it, and they would end this. Dawn on the 5th day painted the sky above the town in pale, washed-out tones. The air was cool and damp with dew, but the promise of the day's heat was already palpable. Clay's team himself, Deputy Miller, and 2 seasoned rangers, Henderson and Walker, set out at first light. They were heavily armed. Clay carried his pump-action shotgun and the .44 Magnum on his hip. Miller and the Rangers had semi-automatic AR-15 rifles and shotguns. Every man was utterly focused, their faces grim. They returned to the clearing where the hunters had died the day before. The creature's tracks, despite the night, were still visible. Huge prints and dark bloodstains on the ground and leaves. The trail led deeper into the woods, toward a swampy lowland overgrown with dense brush and old, gnarled trees. It was difficult terrain, rarely entered by humans. They followed the trail. Progress was slow, forcing their way through blackberry thickets and grasping branches. The ground underfoot became increasingly soft, sucking at their boots with each step. Here the tracks were exceptionally clear, pressed deep into the damp soil. It was evident the creature had moved fast, crashing through the undergrowth, leaving a path of crushed vegetation and snapped twigs. Patches of dark, gray-brown fur clung to sharp branches in places. As they went deeper, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. Sunlight barely penetrated the dense leaf canopy, casting a dim, greenish gloom. The silence felt unnatural. Even the birds had fallen quiet. The team was on edge, fingers tight on their weapons. Miller kept casting anxious glances around, his young face pale. Henderson and Walker, more experienced, moved silently, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Clay moved at the front, his large body moving with surprising stealth. He drew on old military instincts honed in jungles far away. Constantly scanning, checking flanks, listening for the slightest sound. His senses, sharpened by years as a Marine and a sheriff, screamed danger. The air felt charged, heavy with the premonition of something terrible. He sensed they were close, that they were being watched. They were being watched. The ambush was sprung in a particularly dense thicket near a small creek choked with dark, stagnant water. The attack was sudden, ferocious. An earth-shattering, furious roar seemed to shake the trees. From the brush, like a huge, blurred smear of gray-brown fur, the creature burst upon them. It moved with incredible, almost impossible speed for its size. It was definitely not a bear. The body was leaner, more muscular, with long, powerful limbs ending in massive claws. The head was large, with a protracted muzzle filled with razor-sharp fangs. But the most terrifying features were the eyes, large, yellow, burning with a frenzied, malevolent fire. It charged on all fours, low to the ground, but in the instant before striking, it could abruptly rear up onto its hind legs for a swipe or a leap. It happened in seconds. Chaos. The creature's roar mixed with the crack of gunfire. The Rangers and Miller instinctively opened fire. Rifle rounds and shotgun blasts slammed into the massive body. The creature shrieked in pain, fur flying where the shots hit, dark blood spraying. It recoiled, but the fury in its burning eyes only intensified. Its movements were erratic, unpredictable, dodging and weaving with astonishing agility. It made a lightning-fast lunge at Walker, knocking him off his feet with a powerful blow from a forelimb. Before Henderson could react, the thing spun and launched itself at Miller. Clay saw it happen out of the corner of his eye, saw the huge furred body crash into his deputy, saw the long black claws sink into the young man's chest and shoulder, ripping through flesh and uniform. Miller's cry was cut off in a choked gasp. Blood erupted onto the ground. Rage, cold and absolute, flooded Clay. He forgot the shotgun in his hands. Instinctively, he drew his .44 Magnum. The creature lifted its blood-soaked head from its victim. It looked straight at Clay. No more than 10 feet separated them. Clay raised the revolver and fired. Again and again. The heavy .44 slugs slammed into the creature's side and chest with deafening roars. Each impact made a sickening, wet sound of tearing flesh. The creature let out a prolonged, blood-curdling howl, a mixture of agony and berserk fury. Dark blood poured from the new wounds, matting its fur, pooling on the ground beneath it. It staggered back, reeling, took several stumbling steps. It glared at Clay, yellow eyes blazing with a hatred that felt primal, conscious, utterly inhuman. Then, breathing hard, limping noticeably on one foreleg, it turned and vanished with astonishing speed, despite its injuries, into the dense thicket, leaving a wide trail of blood behind it. Clay stood, breathing heavily, the magnum smoking in his hand. The sounds of the fight died away, leaving a ringing silence broken only by the groans of the injured walker and the rustle of leaves where the creature had disappeared. He looked down at Miller's body at his feet. The young man's face was contorted in a final rictus of agony. Clay had seen the creature clearly, seen its unnatural strength, speed, fury, seen it take wounds that should have stopped or killed any animal, no matter how large, multiple hits from rifles and shotguns, and at least 3 or 4.44 Magnum rounds at point-blank range. But it had escaped. Bleeding, wounded, but alive and moving fast. All doubt, all attempts at rational explanation crumbled to dust. This was no animal, not a bear, not a wolf, not a mountain lion. It was something else, something impossible, ripped from the darkest nightmares. He slowly lowered the revolver. Henderson rushed to Walker, helping him up. The ranger's wounds weren't life-threatening, deep claw gashes on his shoulder and arm, severe bruising. He and Clay exchanged a look. In the experienced ranger's eyes was the same dawning comprehension of the terrifying truth that Clay had just grasped. The three of them, Clay, Henderson, and the injured Walker, struggled to lift Miller's body. The trek back out of the woods was long and agonizing. The return of Clay's group to town without Miller, but with his body wrapped in a tarp, and the wounded ranger Walker, was the final straw that broke the dam of fear and disbelief. When Clay and Henderson, supplementing each other's accounts, laid out the details of the attack to Mayor Stevens and a few key town figures, including a couple of the most respected old hunters, even the staunchest skeptics understood. This was no bear. It was something else, monstrous and inexplicable within the bounds of known reality. The description of its incredible speed, strength, glowing yellow eyes, its movement on both forelegs and two, and most crucially, its astonishing resistance to gunfire painted a picture of a nightmare creature. The last barrier of denial collapsed. Panic gave way to a numb, paralyzing terror. The town was under siege, not by a predator, but by a monster. Clay convened an emergency closed-door meeting in his office. Present were his remaining deputies, Ranger Henderson, a pale but resolute Mayor Stevens, Doc Hoffman the vet, and two hunters who had been part of the search, the elderly, quiet Ben Carter, and a sturdy, middle-aged man named Mike Jenkins. The atmosphere was heavy enough to cut with a knife. Clay stood by the county map, his large frame radiating tension. He spoke evenly, almost without emotion, but the weight in his voice was palpable. He described, bluntly and without embellishment, what he had seen in the woods. A creature resembling a giant wolf, or some wolf-bear hybrid, but with features unlike any known animal. He detailed its movement, its incredible power and speed, its ability to withstand multiple gunshot wounds. He specifically mentioned the heavy bleeding after his magnum shots, the only encouraging detail. It fits what Baker described, he concluded. It stood on its hind legs. The room was deathly silent. Faces were pale, eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and disbelief. Mayor Stevens nervously fiddled with his tie. "The National Guard," he muttered. "We have to call the Guard. Immediately." Ranger Henderson, grim and focused, nodded. Clay's account explains the strange tracks, the nature of the wounds on the bodies. It all fits, as crazy as it sounds. Old Ben Carter slowly raised his head. His face was a road map of wrinkles, His eyes held a lifetime of looking. "I heard stories from my granddaddy," he said quietly. "He logged these mountains. Told tales of a wolf man. Nobody believed him. Course. Figured it was just campfire talk." A tense silence hung in the air. The word werewolf wasn't spoken aloud, but it hovered, unspoken yet undeniable. Clay scanned the faces. "I'm not against calling for help," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "But by the time they get here, figure out what's going on. How many more people will die? This thing is wounded. It's bleeding. It's holed up somewhere out there, licking its wounds, but it'll be back. We saw it can be hurt. That means it can be killed. It just takes a hell of a lot more than we thought." He looked at the hunters. "This is our town, our problem, and we need to handle it. Now." His authority, his unwavering resolve, backed by the terrifying truth of what had happened, had its effect. The fear in the room shifted, hardened into grim determination. They nodded in agreement. A plan began to form. First, Clay ordered Henderson and his men to meticulously search the site of the last encounter while the trail was fresh. They needed every possible piece of evidence. More blood samples, scraps of fur, maybe broken claws or teeth, any tissue fragments. Pay special attention to the blood trail. Determine the direction the wounded creature had fled. The ranger team returned several hours later with new findings. They'd managed to collect several more vials of the dark blood, a few tufts of coarse gray-brown fur snagged on bushes, and, crucially, a small piece of flesh apparently torn loose by a bullet, and the shard of a long black claw. It all went immediately to Doc Hoffman. The vet worked through the night. In the morning, he presented his findings to Clay. The tissue analysis confirmed the anomalous cell structure, but the most startling discovery concerned blood clotting and tissue regeneration. "Clay, this is incredible," Hoffman said, cleaning his glasses. "Judging by the coagulation rate and the cellular state in the tissue sample, this creature possesses an extraordinarily rapid regenerative ability. Not instantaneous, mind you. Severe wounds, like the ones you inflicted, will take time to heal. They'll weaken it, force it to retreat, seek shelter. But given time, it could potentially recover fully, unless the damage was catastrophic or hit vital organs. This changed everything. Now they knew what they were facing. Not just a strong, cunning predator, but a monster capable of healing from grievous wounds. The paradigm of the hunt shifted. This was no longer a hunt in the conventional sense. It was an extermination operation. The goal wasn't just to kill it, but to destroy it, to inflict such massive trauma that regeneration became impossible. Clay announced a full mobilization of the town's available resources. He contacted the sheriff of the neighboring larger county and, using all his authority without delving into the unbelievable specifics, he cited an abnormally large and aggressive killer bear posing an extreme threat, requested temporary backup, specifically heavier weaponry and ammunition. He was promised a shipment of automatic shotguns and several M16 rifles from the National Guard Reserve Depot, along with an increased supply of slugs and heavy buckshot. The town effectively went into lockdown. Night patrols were heavily armed and reinforced. Residents were strictly ordered to stay indoors after sunset and avoid leaving the town limits if possible. The school was temporarily closed. The town held its breath, waiting for the next confrontation, knowing it had to be decisive. In the sheriff's office, now an operations center, the atmosphere was tense and focused. Clay Boudre, Ranger Henderson, and the two most experienced hunters, Ben Carter and Mike Jenkins, huddled over a large county map dotted with marks. They methodically compiled and analyzed all information on the creature's movements and attacks. The tourist's death site near Bear Creek, the Cutter farm on the outskirts, the clearing where the hunters were killed, the location of the last firefight where Walker was wounded and Miller died. They searched for patterns. The routes clearly favored areas rich in game and close to water sources, creeks and the small river running through the woods. Its activity times were erratic. Attacks occurred day and night, but the peak aggression seemed to fall around dusk and the early hours after sunset. Retreat paths after attacks were swift and led into the most inaccessible, swampy or rocky parts of the forest. The hypothesis of a lair emerged, a place the monster might retreat to recover from its wounds and rest between hunts. Likely locations included several abandoned mine shafts on the north slope of Black Rock Mountain, a system of small caves in the rock outcroppings near the river, or the dense, nearly impassable thickets in the swampy lowlands where humans rarely ventured. Sending scouting parties to find the lair was quickly dismissed. It would be suicidal. Confronting the creature on its own turf, possibly cornered in an enclosed space, was too risky. Clay reasoned pragmatically based on what they knew for sure. The creature could be wounded. It bled. Its tissues were vulnerable to bullets, especially high-caliber ones. The question was the amount of damage needed for guaranteed destruction, given its regenerative abilities. He recalled his military training, briefings before assault operations, massed, concentrated fire on the target using weapons designed for maximum tissue damage. The idea wasn't just to shoot the monster, but to literally tear it apart with overwhelming firepower, leaving no chance for recovery. They decided against searching for the lair and instead planned to lure the creature into a prearranged kill zone. After studying the map and debating options, they selected a suitable location, a relatively open clearing, roughly 100 by 150 yards, located about 1.5 miles from the last encounter site, on a likely route between its hunting grounds and potential shelters. The clearing was surrounded by dense forest, offering good concealment for firing positions. Meticulous preparation began. Under armed guard, a small team went to the site. In the center of the clearing, they placed bait, the carcass of a large deer, taken the previous day by one of the hunters. Nearby, they set up a powerful electronic caller capable of mimicking the sounds of a wounded animal. And as an added trigger, recordings of human screams for help. Clay cynically reasoned this might attract a predator that had already tasted human flesh. Around the clearing, in carefully camouflaged positions, behind thick tree trunks, in shallow foxholes covered with branches and sod, firing points were established. The positions were sited to create overlapping fields of fire covering the entire clearing. 6 positions were prepared for 12 shooters working in pairs. Their armament was the most potent available. Benelli M4 automatic shotguns, 12-gauge pump actions loaded with slugs, and 00 buckshot M16 rifles, and several high-caliber hunting rifles, .30, 06 Springfield, .300 Winchester Magnum. For nighttime operations, several powerful portable floodlights were prepared, powered by gasoline generators positioned at a distance and camouflaged. The lights were aimed at the center of the clearing, ready to be switched on instantly to blind and disorient the creature. On the approaches to the clearing, along the likely paths to the bait, several large bear traps were set, not to kill or hold the monster. Clay doubted their ability to do so, but to inflict additional injury, slow it down, and possibly make it cry out, giving warning of its approach. Artificial obstacles of branches and small logs were created to channel the creature towards the center of the kill zone, into the crossfire. As weapons of last resort, should the creature breach the firing line, Clay prepared several stun grenades from police stores and a couple of cans of gasoline that could be quickly deployed and ignited with a flare or lighter. Clay personally oversaw all preparations and assigned roles. He himself would be at one of the central positions to coordinate the firing. Henderson commanded another key position and the Rangers. The hunters and deputies were assigned to the remaining spots. He designated men responsible for the lights and communications. The final briefing was short and brutal. "Listen up," Clay said, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him, tense, focused, but filled with grim resolve. "The second this thing hits the clearing and I give the signal, the lights go on. Immediately after, everyone opens fire, simultaneously. Pour it on, don't spare ammo. Aim for center mass, chest, belly, and the limbs. Take away its mobility. If it gets close, aim for the head. We fire until it goes down and stays down. Then we fire some more, just to be sure. We need to tear it apart. No hesitation, no mercy. Remember Miller, Cutter, the tourists, the hunters. This is for the survival of our town. We end this tonight." That evening, under the cover of deepening twilight, the group moved out to the ambush site. 12 shooters, Clay, Henderson, and several others for support and communication. They took their positions, checked their weapons and radios, and melted into the landscape. The generators were started, idling quietly, their low hum barely audible in the woods. The electronic caller remained off. It would be activated later, so as not to spook the target prematurely. Silence fell. A heavy, pregnant silence of waiting. The hours of waiting stretched interminably. Night fully descended, cloaking the forest in a thick blanket of darkness. The moon hid behind clouds, leaving the clearing sunk in near absolute gloom, faintly diluted by starlight filtering through gaps in the overcast. The shooters sat motionless in their hides, becoming part of the nocturnal landscape. Tension mounted with each passing minute. The silence was broken only by the normal sounds of the night woods, the chirping of crickets, a distant coyote howl, the rustle of leaves in a slight breeze. But now, each sound felt like a potential harbinger of doom. Clay sat in his position, Jenkins, one of his deputies, beside him. He held his automatic shotgun ready, the revolver nearby. He maintained strict radio silence, only occasionally requesting readiness confirmations from other positions with brief coded signals. Everyone was in place. Everyone waited. More than 3 hours had passed since they took up positions. Nerves were frayed raw. Clay began to doubt. Would the bait work? Had the creature moved to a different part of the woods? He decided to activate the caller. A soft click from the speaker and the plaintive, intermittent cries of a wounded deer echoed across the clearing. The sound was eerie in the night's stillness. but it was designed to attract a predator. Another 10 minutes of tense waiting passed. Then suddenly, from the direction of one of the traps set on the approach, came a sharp metallic clang, followed by a short, furious snarl and the sound of snapping branches. "Stand by," Clay whispered into the radio. "Coming in from the northwest." Hearts hammered, fingers tightened on triggers. A few more seconds crawled by, feeling like an eternity. And then, from the darkness at the edge of the clearing, the creature emerged. It moved slowly, cautiously, low to the ground, testing the air. One of the traps had indeed sprung on its foreleg, but the steel jaws had only briefly held it. The creature had ripped its paw free, leaving fur and blood in the trap, and now limped noticeably. Its silhouette in the faint starlight looked even more grotesque and terrifying than in daylight. Huge, muscular body covered in dark fur, long limbs, powerful head with glowing yellow eyes scanning the darkness. It paused at the edge of the clearing, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of the bait. "Now," Clay commanded into the radio. Instantly, the operators hit the switches. Bright beams flooded the clearing, snatching the creature from the darkness, blinding it. It let out a furious, stunned roar and instinctively shielded its eyes with a paw. And in that same instant, from all sides simultaneously, the kill zone erupted in a maelstrom of fire. The thunder of shotguns and rifles merged into a continuous roar that tore the night apart. Slugs and buckshot ripped through the air, slamming into the monster's massive body. The creature roared again, this time in agony and rage. It staggered, fell to its side, but immediately tried to push itself up on its forelegs. Bullets continued to tear into its flesh, ripping out chunks of muscle and fur, leaving dark holes from which blood poured profusely. Its vitality was astonishing. Blinded by the light, deafened by the roar of guns, it thrashed around the illuminated clearing like a cornered animal, trying to locate the source of the assault, trying to find cover. Blood gushed from dozens of wounds, but it kept moving, snarling, snapping. Despite the hail of lead and grievous wounds, survival instinct and blind fury drove it on. It made a desperate, lurching charge toward one of the firing positions occupied by two hunters. It came straight at them, ignoring the impacts, roaring, its bloody maw wide open. The hunters, having reloaded, fired point blank. Buckshot hammered the creature's chest and head, but failed to stop it instantly. It crashed into their hide, scattering branches and earth. There were shouts, more gunshots. Then the sickening thud of impact and the death rattle of one of the hunters. The thing had managed to strike with its terrible claws before the second hunter could scramble away. Clay saw it. Saw how even under such concentrated fire the monster remained lethally dangerous. He saw something else too. In the glare of the floodlights, the edges of some of the shallower wounds on its body seemed to shimmer, to pulse slightly, even as blood streamed from them. Regeneration. It was working even under fire. "Keep firing. Don't stop." Clay roared into the radio. He knew they needed to be even more decisive. Use everything. He signaled Jenkins. The deputy quickly grabbed one of the gas cans and, choosing his moment, hurled it toward the creature thrashing under the onslaught. The can burst, dousing the monster and the ground around it with fuel. Clay snatched up a flare pistol and fired. The flare hissed, struck near the creature, and in the same second, the gasoline erupted in a whoosh of bright orange flame, engulfing the monster and part of the clearing. A soul-shattering howl tore through the air, filled with inhuman agony. The burning monster thrashed even more violently, trying to beat out the flames. The shooter's fire never ceased for a second. Clay himself emptied the magazine of his automatic shotgun into the burning, writhing figure, aiming for the head and chest. This combined assault, the relentless gunfire, the searing burns, the shock, finally overwhelmed the monster's incredible resistance. After another series of heavy slugs ripped into its core, the creature staggered, took a few uncertain steps, then collapsed heavily onto the ground, lying still amidst the flames and pools of its own blood. The gunfire continued for several more seconds, turning the unmoving body into a riddled, smoking ruin. Then, on Clay's command, the shooting stopped. An overwhelming silence descended. After the furious cacophony of the battle, it pressed down, feeling unnatural. The air was thick with the acrid smells of gunpowder, burnt fur, gasoline, and blood. The flames in the clearing slowly died down, leaving patches of scorched earth and the charred body at the center. None of the shooters moved from their cover immediately. They sat or stood at their positions, breathing heavily, trying to process what had happened. The only sounds were the ticking of cooling gun barrels, ragged breathing, and the low moans of the injured hunter from the position the creature had overrun. Clay slowly rose from his spot. He kept the shotgun ready, finger near the trigger. He motioned for the others to stay put, and began to cautiously approach the still form in the center of the clearing. Jenkins and Henderson followed, covering the smoking mass with their weapons. Drawing closer, Clay took in the horrific sight. What lay on the ground barely resembled a living creature anymore. It was a torn, charred, bloody mess of fur, muscle, bone, and seared flesh, riddled with dozens of bullets and buckshot pellets. Yet, even in this state, its monstrous nature was palpable. Clay walked right up to it and, without hesitation, fired a final, deliberate shot from his magnum into what remained of its head. The body jerked from the impact, but showed no other sign of life. The creature was dead, utterly and irrevocably. Only when the monster's death was confirmed did the others begin to emerge from their positions, slowly converging on the center of the clearing. Their faces were pale, streaked with sweat and dirt, eyes reflecting a mixture of shock, relief, and the horror of what they had witnessed. In the light of the remaining floodlights and flashlights, they examined the remains more closely. Huge fangs, blackened by fire, jutted from the torn muzzle. The long claws on the mangled paws were broken but still looked deadly. The unnatural structure of its limbs and spine confirmed this was no known animal. It was something else, a thing of darkness they had somehow managed to destroy. But victory had come at a cost. They tallied the losses. 1 hunter killed when the creature attacked his position. Another wounded. The monster's claws had laid open his shoulder and arm. He'd lost a lot of blood but was alive. He was given immediate first aid. The elation of vanquishing an unimaginable horror mingled with the bitterness of losing a comrade and the sheer weight of the ordeal. Clay moved among the survivors, his face grim as ever, but his eyes held a deep weariness and the somber satisfaction of a duty fulfilled. He briefly clapped a few men on the shoulder, checked on the wounded man. The inevitable question arose: what to do with the body? Leaving it was unthinkable. Eventually, someone would find it, and then the questions would start. Investigations, scientists, journalists, the curious. It would bring unwanted attention to Pine Creek, breed panic and speculation potentially worse than the truth. Worse still, some might want to study or even exploit the creature's remains. Clay made the only decision he felt he could, from his pragmatic viewpoint. "We have to destroy it," he said quietly but firmly. "Completely. Leave no trace. No one outside this group can ever know what really happened here." Everyone silently agreed. This was their secret, their burden. Under Clay and Henderson's direction, the grim work of erasing the evidence began. First, the monster's body was hacked into pieces with axes, a heavy, nauseating task performed with grim determination. The remains were then carried deeper into the woods, to a small ravine away from the clearing. They doused the parts with the remaining gasoline and set them ablaze again. They fed the pyre for hours, until nothing was left but ash and charred bone fragments. These were carefully collected and buried deep in the earth. The clearing itself, the site of the battle, was meticulously cleaned. Spent casings collected. Blood pools covered with dirt. Signs of the struggle obscured as much as possible. It was long, grueling work, finished only near dawn. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, the exhausted, grimy, silent group started back towards town. They carried the body of their fallen comrade and supported the wounded man. Victory was theirs, the monster was gone, but there was no joy. Only emptiness and a heavy weight on their souls. They had to deliver the terrible news to the dead hunter's family. They had to live with the memory of this night and the secret they would carry to their graves. Back in town, Clay met immediately with Mayor Stevens. They quickly agreed on the official story to be presented to the townspeople and the outside world. A dangerous, abnormally large and aggressive bear, responsible for the tourist's death and the attacks on the farm and hunters, had been tracked and destroyed in a planned and risky operation by the sheriff's office, rangers, and volunteer hunters. Tragically, during the final confrontation with the enraged beast, there were casualties. One brave hunter lost his life, another was injured. The specific details of the attacks, the creature's true nature, and the realities of the final battle would remain the secret of the small group directly involved. To everyone else, it was just a very big, very mean bear. It was simpler that way, safer for everyone. A few days later, funerals were held in the small town. They said goodbye to Deputy Bill Miller, a young man full of promise, whose life had ended so terribly in the deep woods. They also mourned Dan Richards, the hunter killed during the final ambush, a husband, father, respected member of the community. The small-town church was overflowing. The atmosphere was heavy with grief, quiet tears, and unspoken questions. The forest, always a part of their lives, now evoked fear and mistrust. Clay Boudre attended both services. He stood slightly apart, massive, unmoving, in his dress uniform. His face was impassive stone, but deep in his gray eyes lay a burden, the weight of responsibility for these deaths, for the secret he was forced to keep. He listened silently to words of condolence, nodded, shook hands, but offered few words of his own. He was the sheriff. He had to be strong, the anchor for his frightened, grieving town. Slowly, very slowly, life began to return to its usual sleepy rhythm. The fear that had hung thick in the air began to dissipate, replaced by mourning, and then by a dull relief that the nightmare was over. The official story of the giant bear was accepted by most without question. people wanted to believe in a comprehensible, if terrifying, explanation. They wanted to forget the horror and return to normalcy. The woods became just woods again, though many residents, especially those on the outskirts, avoided them for a long time, and parents warned their children more strictly against playing near the tree line. Quiet returned to Pine Creek, but it was a different quiet, watchful, fragile. The few who had been in that final battle in the clearing, who had seen the monster and knew the truth, were bound by the invisible ties of their shared secret. A special, unspoken understanding existed between them. They avoided catching each other's eyes on the street, never spoke of what happened, even among themselves. But each knew what they had endured together. That knowledge set them apart from the rest of the town, forging an unseen brotherhood sealed in blood and terror. Clay returned to his daily duties as sheriff. Petty thefts, Saturday night brawls outside the bar, neighborly disputes. The routine absorbed him. But he was changed. He became even more withdrawn, sterner, more taciturn. The loss of Miller, the young man he'd almost considered a son, and the confrontation with the impossible, with something that shattered his pragmatic worldview, had left a deep, indelible mark. He never showed it, hiding his inner turmoil behind the familiar mask of toughness, but something inside him had broken, or perhaps hardened beyond measure. He guarded the order in his town even more fiercely, as if trying to prove to himself and the world that he was still in control, that his world still obeyed understandable laws. Some of the survivors of the battle began showing signs of what would later be called post-traumatic stress. The hunter wounded in the shoulder grew withdrawn and irritable. Another started drinking too heavily. Nightmares plagued them. The sounds of the night woods triggered panic attacks. But in a small southern town where men weren't accustomed to complaining or showing weakness, these things weren't discussed openly. They coped in their own ways, with alcohol, hard work, sullen silence. The strange circumstances surrounding multiple deaths in a short period, and the inevitable rumors that leaked beyond the county lines attracted fleeting outside attention. A persistent journalist from a state newspaper showed up once, trying to sniff out a killer bear sensation. A couple of weeks later, some official from the state's Department of Natural Resources arrived, asking awkward questions about the animal elimination operation. Clay Boer met both with cold, undisguised hostility. He used his authority and forbidding demeanor to shut down any attempts to dig deeper. He provided the official reports corroborated by the mayor and rangers, and made it clear their curiosity was unwelcome. The official story stood, immovable as rock. The outsiders left empty-handed, met by a wall of silence and resentment. Clay personally insured the heavy weapons acquired from the neighboring county and used in the ambush. The automatic shotguns, the M16S, were not returned. He logged them as necessary upgrades to his office's arsenal and locked them securely in the armory. He and his men now knew the world could be far more dangerous than it appeared. They knew that sometimes you faced things you could never be prepared for. But now they were armed not just with weapons, but with knowledge. The knowledge that darkness was real and could come again. Sometimes in rare, quiet moments, Clay would walk to his office window and stare for a long time at the dark wall of forest encircling the town. Order had been restored. The price had been paid, but his gaze remained heavy, He knew that beneath the surface of the familiar world lay hidden depths, and that the fragile balance could be broken at any moment. The darkness could return in any shape, however unimaginable, and he had to be ready to face it again.